Quiet on set.
Good morning. I'm Mark Staples, and I am here today conducting a continuing series of legislative candidate interviews for Bresnan Communications and the Montana Cable Television Association, your sponsors. And my guest this morning is House District 93 incumbent Representative Ron Erickson. Ron's opponent, Denise Moore, could not be with us, so Ron will be able to we'll have a chat. I'd like to start by having you introduce yourself to the viewers, give your background, and maybe just a flavor of your political philosophy and your emphases.
Thanks, Mark. I need to start by making a slight correction. I was in the House of Representatives for 3 terms in House District 64. Rosie Buzzes is now the representative for House District 93, and she's term limited.
Thank you.
So that's the direction there. Let me say something about myself. My wife and I came to Missoula, Montana in 1965. I was hired by the chemistry department, University of Montana, to be a professor. I loved teaching. I loved teaching so much that I kept switching over time. I switched to environmental studies in particular, and was the director of that program, so I have administrative experience. I did a heck of a lot of research for a long time in chemistry. I taught in the humanities program. I'm very interested in ethics, and I taught in the philosophy department for ethics, and at the end of my career was teaching mostly environmental ethics. I've had a 41-year record of civic engagement. My civic engagement has often been environmental, but in recent years, for example, I've been recently named by the County Commission to the Planning Board. I've been on the Planning Board for the last 2 years. I was elected county-wide to the Commission to study county government. In the 90s, we've got an open space bond now. I hope everybody votes for it here in Missoula. But I was the chairperson for the committee that put forth the 1995 bond and devised the process for the buying of the North Hills and Mount Jumbo, the wonderful land out at Fort Missoula, the trail system. So I've been very proud of the work that I've been able to do in the community, as well as those 6 years in the legislature. You ask about my political philosophy, I'm a progressive Democrat. I'm conservative in a particular way of worrying very much about budget matters, but basically progressive on everything else.
Speaking of budget, you've been, because you were a 3-term representative in another district, you've been there, and you've been there through times of a dearth of funds, and now we seem to have, at least for the short term, a surfeit of funds somewhere between $550 million and $750 million. And as you know, there are competing plans. The Democrats' plan, which is called the Square Deal for Montana, and the Republicans, which is called the Handshake with Montana, that has as parts of it how to spend parts of the surplus. Do you endorse either of those plans wholesale, or do you have your own ideas of how we use this money?
I have my own ideas about it, but I also want to go back a bit historically, because you're right, there have been some bad years. I recall particularly in 2001, where the bubble hit, the dot-com bubble hit, and we were called back into special session and we had to make budget cuts. And that was a very, very tough situation, so that I worry a lot about budget estimates. In my 3 terms, I served, one of my major areas was House Taxation Committee. One of the first things we do is to look at what the revenue estimate is. And so, you know, it's interesting that right now the estimate $750 million. We'll take a second look at that in January and February and come up with the best decision we can make. But we have to be different than we were in other years, where we left there with $30 and $40 million surpluses on the budget, and then that hit comes and you have to cut programs. We can't let that happen. We have to end with a better surplus than we have before. Do I agree with either of the two plans? Not entirely. Not entirely. First of all, I am convinced that a lot of this surplus is one-time only. And that means that we ought not start major new programs without having the money to start them. I think that we need to put some money into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. I'm going to change the name of that to House Montana, but more money into that. Back in 2001, I sponsored a couple of bills to get money into that program, and then by the fall, we had to cut some of it back out again. It can be money well spent. We have a situation where we need infrastructure in this state. Too long a time that we have not spent money on infrastructure, whether or not that's school buildings, and I've heard Robin Hamilton talk, and I think he has some good ideas on that, but we have right here in Missoula a major area of development in Miller Creek, and a promise at one time that there would be a bridge built so that people from Miller Creek could cross the Bitterroot River. We should be spending some of the balloon-type money for that kind of infrastructure. The way I'd prefer to do that would be not to have the state legislature decide how that's being spent, but rather have the counties decide how that money should be spent. We do have a property tax problem, but it's focused on particularly elderly people with residential property tax. So I do not like the Republican plan that was going to be a major tax break for Conoco and Exxon. We need to make sure that any kind of property tax relief we give is focused and focused on residential property tax owners, and perhaps even if we can, particularly going to seniors.
You may have been going here, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but
Sure.
The Montana Supreme Court, came as no surprise to most, found that our system for funding elementary and high school education, what they call K through 12, was illegal and not adequate. Inadequate, I think, was the actual legal word they used, and gave it to the legislature to deal with. And $100 million or $80 million cash infusion was made in the last regular session, $37 million in the special session. Some have opined that the problem has been addressed and the system fixed. Others opine differently. Where do you believe we are? And I know that you have a particular interest in higher education,
Yeah.
but let's address K through 12 right now. Where are we in addressing inadequacies that some people feel we have?
I think it's not yet fixed. As you know, candidates like to talk to people. I was knocking doors again last night. I chatted with a student at the University of Montana, a person who's about to graduate in education, and I said, gee, are you going to be able to stay here? And he says, no, my debts are too high and the starting salaries are too low. Here, we have to get to the place where we keep our bright young people, kids who want to teach. We have to be able to keep them in Montana, and that means more money into K-12, particularly so that we can keep those folks. We've got an awful lot of people, particularly in the Missoula area, in the teaching profession, who are about to retire. We need to be able to get the best and brightest to stay.
What
And
is
so
the,
I
what
would
is
put
the
money-
average teacher's salary in Montana?
I don't know.
But it does not compare with
It does not
other
compare, and
states.
particularly it doesn't compare at the starting level. We have people who can go out and make 10, 20,000 more. They wouldn't necessarily, we don't necessarily have to go 10, 20,000 more, but we have to go higher for starting salaries.
What about the other time bomb that's ticking? The public employees pension program, which despite a $100 million cash infusion in the last session, is approximately 1.3 billion out of whack actuarially. How do we deal with that?
Well, it's, I didn't list it amongst the things I
Yes.
think we need to spend money on, but you're right, we do need to spend money there, and we need, the neat thing that you can do is if you put money up front, then that actuarial final loss is going to be much smaller than the 1.3 billion that you talk about. So now is the time to put some money into that system. And I know that the governor and Dave Ewer are certainly thinking about doing that.
Yes,
I'm
David
gonna
has proposed, via this article, David has proposed to put another infusion of cash, and you would support that?
I would certainly support that. And I was fortunate enough in my very first term in the legislature to sit right behind David Ewer. He's a guy I trust incredibly. He knows stuff. And if he says we can do this, then I know we can. If we're actually having a bit more money, 750 instead of 500 million, we might be able to put more in and be able to solve the problem, because it's a problem that you need to solve early on and not wait.
Well, David has an interesting background. As you know, I think he was a chief financial analyst for the Board of Investments.
Right.
So if anybody knows what number they need to hit on a yearly basis with those investments, it would be David.
And he knows too, he also remembers 2001. And he remembers that when the stock market crashes, you can run into problems with your investment portfolio. So trying to recover some of that money now is just a good idea.
These have been general overview topics which will weave in and out of every decision somebody who goes to the legislature will make, and that's why I bring them up, because they will touch on everything else that comes to you. What about more specific constituent-based proposals? Do you have anything you're going to carry that you know of now, or anything that you want to concentrate on?
I mentioned earlier on that I'd been appointed by the county commissioners to our planning board. I, of course, as a person with a background in environmental studies, have been interested in planning and all sorts of environmental issues, and I'm quite sure that I'll have some other environmental bills to carry as well. But particularly on planning, what state law forces almost is it tells counties that are rapidly growing that they ought to have a growth policy, and it's wonderful. It also allows for neighborhood plans to be a part of that growth policy. And I think it's the more we get decision making down to the neighborhood level, the better. So I've always been for that. But then state law also says that yes, you ought to have a growth policy, but you may not use it to ever say no. You can only use it to say yes. And I find that to be silly. And so the first bill that I'm going to put in is that. Second bill is also in planning. We need to be able to get a handle on putting in transportation systems before the developments come. We have real difficulties now, and I mentioned the Miller Creek situation. We have out at Mullen Road a disastrous situation. Development after development with poor planning for getting the people out of the Mullen Road area and across Reserve Street.
I take it there'll be no argument from you for the governor's proposal to freeze tuition with a cash infusion.
Absolutely.
It almost goes without saying, but I suppose you want to get on the record.
I certainly want to be on the record with that. We have a situation where you can think back 20, 30 years where the state government paid 2/3 of the way a university runs, and now it's less than 40%. I happened to serve under John Mercer in my first term, and it was interesting when John quit being the chair of the Board of Regents that he said, gee, I spent all my time screwing over the university system, and now Governor Schweitzer, you ought to make up for it. Well, I wish that John had come to that decision a little earlier. But he's right.
Of course, it would be a very healthy debate to have John in the room with us.
Yes, yes.
That would
yes, but
that would rejoin a debate that you and John had for years, I suspect.
Yes, and by the way, I happen to respect John Mercer a great deal. He helped me a lot. He put me on the committees I wanted to be on. You know how it works, Mark. You have the session, and then you have the intercession. And he put me on 3 major committees right after my first year, and I really appreciated it.
I always thought John was a man of strong convictions, and his word was his bond. He just disagreed with certain people.
Yeah.
But I think he's proven to have an open and evolving mind.
Yes.
Yeah. Public lands. There's some discussion that there are vast land holdings in Montana that private entities have, and right now the timber value of those or others is now being surpassed by the development value, which if you have stockholders, the temptation or just the responsibility of your stockholders would be, what do we, do we take a diminished value or do we take the most value? So there's some concern that these lands will be sold for development rights. To address that, there are some proposals. I've seen the Missoulian make this proposal and others, that some of these surplus funds be used to buy those lands and preserve them, or at least make sure that they have guaranteed public access.
That's the key. That's the key, the public access. If we can spend some money to assure public access for hunters and fishermen, for access to mountain beauty trails, we ought to do it. You know, when I served on the Open Space Advisory Committee for Missoula, our original idea was to hope to be able to get conservation easements rather than outright purchase as much as we could. It worked out that during the 5 years that I worked on that project, mostly we bought because it's got to be, willing seller, and so you've got to deal with that.
Yeah.
I feel the same way about state lands. I don't see any incredible need for more state land, but we do need access, and I'd certainly be willing to see some money spent that way.
Ron, we're going to have to wrap up, and so I'll give you an opportunity to close, and in so doing, I guess I would put the same question to you that I would to all candidates. Why you, not your opponent, when the person enters the booth and has to check one box or the other?
I would start with my record. I have a record of civic engagement, and I think it's been an effective record for over 40 years. There are some certain areas, such as school funding. I understand that my opponent believes that K-12 has enough money that they should just rearrange how they spend it. I disagree with that particular idea. I'm the progressive Democrat. I believe that a lot of the people in my district are progressive and want to send a progressive Democrat back to Helena. Certainly Rosie Buzzas was a wonderful representative. I'd feel proud to be able to take her place.
Ron, thank you for coming, and folks, thank you for tuning in. Please exercise your civic responsibility and your civic gift of voting and helping shape our democracy. And on behalf of Breslin's Communication and the Missoula the Montana Cable Television Association, we'd like to thank Ron for joining us, and we'd like to thank you for tuning in.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.